Greg, the floor is yours.
All right, very good. Thanks, Drew. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today in a very timely and important discussion on the topic of misinformation. So before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to introduce our very prestigious panelists for this discussion today. So first, Fred Cook, APR, fellow PRSA, has worked at Golin for over 35 years, during which Fred has had the privilege to work with a variety of high-profile CEOs, including Herb Kelleher, Jeff Bezos, and Steve Jobs. He's also managed a wide scope of crises for his clients, including airline crashes, product recalls, and sexual harassment. In 2014, Fred published Improvise, Unconventional Career Advice from an Unlikely CEO, which shares the wisdom he gained as a cabin boy on a Norwegian tanker, doorman at a five-star hotel, and probably most importantly and most fun, chauffeur for drunks. In 2015, after speaking on college campuses around the world, Fred accepted an additional position with the University of Southern California as the director of the USC Center for Public Relations at the Annenberg School, whose mission is to shape the future of public relations and those who will lead it through research, education, and thought leadership. Fred is a graduate of Indiana University. Cathy Dunkin, APR, fellow PRSA, is a professor of practice in management communication at the Olin Business School in Washington University in St. Louis. She teaches MBA courses in business writing and oral presentations, crisis communications, and executive presence. Before joining Olin in 2013, Cathy built Standing Partnership, a PR firm recognized for positive culture, client results, and leadership in the WorldCom Public Relations Group. She previously held positions with Fortune 500 companies and global agencies in St. Louis, Chicago, and Dallas. Cathy graduated from the University of Missouri School of Journalism, where she discovered public relations as a possible career and served as PRSA chapter president. She was accredited by PRSA in 1990 and became a fellow in 2016. A past St. Louis PRSA chapter president, Cathy also has served on many other professional, civic, and charity boards. Patrick McSweeney, APR, fellow PRSA, uses the skills he learned as a print and broadcast journalist to help clients effectively connect with employees, customers, community leaders, investors, vendors, and others. He serves as public relations strategist and counselor for C-suite executives, providing crisis communications planning, message development, media training, and media relations assistance. Since transitioning to public relations, he served as a spokesperson for a government agency in Florida, as well as for Fortune 500 companies, and worked with well-known automotive, high-tech, retail brands, vacation destinations, and others. Patrick earned the designation APR in 2011, and he was selected to join the College of Fellows in 2015. He's currently the secretary for the Midwest District and will be one of two vice chairs for PRSA's Diversity and Inclusion Committee next year. Patrick has served as president for the Southeastern Wisconsin chapter of PRSA in 2018 and the North Florida chapter in 1995 and 2013. Patrick also has served as adjunct professor at Marquette University in Milwaukee and at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. Patrick earned a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism from the Ohio State University. Did I do that right, Patrick? Yeah, okay, good. John Lyday, APR, fellow PRSA, is the principal of Lyday Communications, a boutique firm that provides a full range of public relations services with a specialty in strategic and behavioral communications. John has more than 40 years of experience and has directed communications for 3 large school districts in Illinois, Tribune Company, when it was a publicly traded Fortune 500 company, Lake County, Illinois government, a $3 billion regional community bank in central Illinois, and the Illinois Association of School Boards. He is president of the Central Illinois chapter of PRSA, past president of the Suburban Chicago chapter of PRSA, from which he received a Lifetime Achievement Award, past president of the Illinois chapter of the National School Public Relations Association, and past regional vice president of NISPRA, representing 8 states in the District of Columbia. John has a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern University and has taken master's level PR courses through Illinois State University. So welcome to our very prestigious panel. Today, we're excited to have you. Okay, let's get started here. So it seems we find ourselves today in what's been called a post-truth era, in which the line that once clearly distinguished truths from untruths has been blurred. hastened by the internet and social media. Fake news has eroded trust in many of our major institutions, from government to Wall Street, corporate America, and even the US electoral system. Big tech, Hollywood, the scientific community, and maybe for this audience, especially the very news media, whose credibility many of us rely on to do our jobs successfully. Example one, we have a reporter standing in front of an all-out inferno claiming that the protests behind him may be fiery, but they're mostly peaceful. We have another reporter standing in front of a mob in Afghanistan chanting "Death to America," who claims the group, quote unquote, seems friendly. Most recently, NBC sports reporter Kelly Stavas single-handedly created a movement when she interviewed NASCAR race winner Brandon Brown and awkwardly told us that the crowd was chanting "Let's go Brandon" instead of what everybody could plainly hear. Sometimes it's almost as if we're being asked to suspend reality and ignore what we see and hear with our own eyes and ears. The inaccuracies, lies, and sometimes blatant disregard for the truth has become an ongoing battle, both by commission and omission. And of course, COVID-19, which has created the motherlode of misinformation. We have a CDC director telling us not to wear masks, then to wear masks, then not to wear masks, and then telling us to wear 2 masks. We've redefined the word vaccine and had protracted battles over whether people were dying from COVID or with COVID, including a Florida man who died in a motorcycle accident but was counted as a COVID death. And a recent survey, of course, found that less than 40% of Americans still believe what Dr. Fauci has to say. So I saw this post recently, which I think most likely reflects how many of us feel on this topic, which is, I used to pay attention to all the numbers and statistics, but I no longer do. Suffering from information fatigue. My eyes just glaze over. I will not miss the reports because I just no longer watch them, which for us as PR professionals and communicators should be a little scary. And then, of course, this one, we have so-called fact checkers who approve certain facts. And I loved this post, which says, hold on a minute, we have legit fact checkers who know all the facts. Why not just set up a TV channel and just report the facts? We could call it the news. Kind of interesting when you think about it. So increasingly, we find ourselves, many of us, operating inside echo chambers that reverberate only information that validates, reflects, and reinforces our own opinions. This bias towards subjective validation has challenged our ability to think clearly and critically. And perhaps some people simply don't even want the truth. They just want constant reassurance that what they believe is in fact the truth. So importantly for PR professionals, the implications for third-party credibility of the media are massive. This quote, I think, sums it up pretty well. I think our messages are credible only if the media that carry them are credible. If we hurt media credibility, we hurt our own. So with that preamble, I want to get everybody involved here, and we have 30-some folks on the line. I wanted to ask you a couple questions, and we'd really like to get everybody to participate. So Drew, can we go ahead and pull up polling question number 1, please?
We sure can.
So question 1, as a communication professional, how concerned are you about the prevalence of misinformation in today's world? Significantly concerned, mildly concerned, or not concerned? And Drew, we'll give it a few seconds here, and then maybe can we share the results?
Absolutely. Looks like about everybody's taken it.
All right. Yeah, I think that reflects in my conversations with colleagues exactly the case. I think 94%, well, 100% are concerned at least at some level. And I think that really validates the importance of this topic today. So let's close that one. Drew, let's go to question number 2, if we can pull that up.
Sure can.
A slightly different take on the same theme here, but so the question is, how much has misinformation impacted your work? Significant impact, minor impact, or no impact? And again, we'll give it a few seconds here for everybody to respond. All right, do we have the results? So about split between significant and minor impact. Of course, depending on what area you practice in, it might have a smaller impact. And certainly for some of us, it's had a pretty significant impact. So I think that's interesting. 100% would agree that it has had at least some impact. All right, let's go with the third question as we finish out our poll. So Drew, if you want to pull that one up. And I'm getting some background feedback. If folks on the call could mute themselves, that would be awesome. All right, question number 3. How has misinformation affected your level of trust in major institutions like government and the media over the past several years? My level of trust has increased, remained the same, or decreased. All right, let's see if we can pull up the results here. Increased, remain the same, decreased. Yeah, interesting. Okay, kind of a split there. About half say it's decreased. 32% remain the same. Okay, interesting. All right. Well, I wanted to do those poll questions to really kind of set the basis for the rest of this conversation. So thank you so much for your participation. And then just a quick reminder for our attendees today, if you have questions for our panelists, please submit them in the chat function. We'll hold them for the final 15 or 20 minutes of today's panel. And you can submit your questions at any time and I'll be monitoring them. All right, so on to the panel, and my job is to be quiet and get out of the way of this prestigious panel here. So we're gonna start with question number 1, and I'm gonna tee this up for Fred. Fred, I want to start with you. So you recently helped Golin and the Annenberg School launch a new report on the polarization index that was designed to dimensionalize the level of discord in America and also to help people make better informed decisions. So I'm wondering if you could share just a few highlights from the report, maybe link them with kind of any practical implications for our industry. And with that, I'm gonna pull up this slide for you, I hope. There we go. All right, take it away, Fred. And I believe you're on mute.
It's 6 a.m. in Los Angeles and I'm already depressed. So thank you very much for that introduction.
I do what I can.
I appreciate it. Yes, you're right. Golin and Signal Labs and the Annenberg School created the polarization index. We worked on it for about a year and we just launched it last week, and you can download it at thepolarizationindex.com. It's a fascinating report. And it uses artificial intelligence to measure the divide between the left and the right. And you can see how that is depicted on this particular slide. We look at 10 different issues and 450 media outlets, and we measure how these articles about these issues are shared both on the left and the right. And then the divide between those is what we call the polarization score. So we actually have a score for every issue of these 10 issues. And then overall, we combine them into an overall polarization score. And in short, what we found is in the year since Biden was elected, that polarization has only dropped a tiny bit in the United States. So it appears that polarization is here to stay. But underneath that, the issues that are driving polarization change quite a bit. And what's surprising when you look at this chart, of the 10 issues we looked at, 8 of them are driven by engagement on the left, which was sort of a surprise to me. But the 2 most polarizing issues, number 1 is immigration and the other is police reform, are driven mainly by the right. So each issue has a different dynamic associated with it. And the purpose for this report, or this index, is to give CEOs and communicators who are more and more having to weigh in on all these different controversial topics, some sort of sense of what the landscape looks like. So they can tell what media are likely to say about their position, what their employees or their customers are likely to say, and just how hot the water is on a lot of different topics. Going down this chart a little bit, racial equity and gun legislation were a different sort of, we call those bilateral polarization. They seem to be polarized equally, both on the left and the right. And that means those issues are going to be polarized for a long time to come, because both sides feel equally passionate about them. And then you have some like COVID-19, which is surprising because it's the issue that's the most discussed in the media. There's most of the media coverage of all these issues about COVID, but it's not the most controversial. It's not the most polarizing. Immigration seems to be the one that politicians and media strategists and the media use to get people riled up. And what we found in this study, back to this topic of misinformation, is the most polarizing issues are driven by the most misinformation. So about 60% of the information shared on the topic of immigration comes from unreliable media sources, which is a pretty staggering number. And then just to close out on the bottom of this chart, you see issues that during the Trump administration were very controversial, like healthcare reform was in the news constantly. But that's changing now, and you can see the right is barely engaged on the topic of healthcare reform. They have moved on to other topics, and this one is now being driven mainly by the left. So it's a fascinating look at polarization through the eyes of the media and social media and the forces that are driving it across the country.
Wow, great overview, and I think that's an interesting foundation for the conversation here this morning. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go with the Brady Bunch view here. So, and then secondly, I want to open that up as a follow-on to the rest of the panel here. So polarization, as Fred said, clearly appears not to be going away anytime soon, and maybe in some cases even more firmly entrenched. So as communicators, right, as PR professionals, how do we factor this into our work? And how do we plan for it? How do we monitor? How do we respond? So I'm going to throw that out to the panel and ask you to chime in.
I'll jump
Greg,
in.
can I,
Yeah.
go ahead, Patrick.
I said I would jump in the deep end first, and come on in, folks. The water is fine. First thing we've got to do as communicators is be very clear in any statements, in any writing. You know, what we've got is, you know, huge disinformation factories that are working. And, you know, so many times, say like the CDC, there was a lot of misinformation coming out, or conflicting information that just fed into that. What we were seeing is science happening in real time. Normally, you know, bringing a drug to market, you know, takes 5-10 years. They did it in 10 months. So there's going to be a lot of conflicting information as things change. But as communicators, we've got to help our clients or our bosses be very clear. And then if information changes, you know, state that and be able to go back and reinforce those newer messages. You know, the other thing we need to do as citizens is hold our leaders accountable, and, you know, ask our congressional representatives and senators to act like congressional representatives and senators and other leaders, rather than, you know, running off and, you know, posting memes and other things. You know, it took record time. It only took, what, 3 weeks for Paul Gosar to be censured by the House yesterday. You know, but up until that point, nobody on his side of the aisle was saying anything about it. It's like, you know, we need to, as citizens, really, you know, raise the bar for everybody else, because obviously the bar has been lowered so low that you could step over it right now.
John, Cathy. Anything to
I'm
add?
happy to add a thought that people forget that a lot of it is you have to listen to what's out there. And I think our job as communicators is to listen and evaluate the sources of information and bring that information to our organizations and our clients so that when we turn around and try to communicate or advocate or bring information.
Oops.
Cathy, I think we might have lost the last part of what you said there. It looks like you slipped back into mute.
Just listening to different sources and evaluating for ourselves and for our clients or our organizations, the credibility of the different sources.
Great, thank you. John, anything to add, or are we ready to move on?
Yeah, I just want to throw a concept out there, and I'd be interested to hear Fred's reaction to it, but I'm a dinosaur here. I've been around for 40 years. I've seen a lot of changes. But one of the things that piqued my interest in the 80s was the whole idea of issues management. There was a process in place that many districts, many organizations and companies used. It kind of fell by the wayside for many of us because it took a lot of time and it took a lot of resources. But I think the theory of that was pretty sound. And I would like to suggest that maybe we need to take a fresh look at that and see if there would be an efficient way using today's technology for organizations and companies to monitor these and stay ahead of these as best they can, recognizing that it's an ever-changing target and sometimes we're not going to be able to stay ahead of them. But we need a tool, I think, as a profession that will help us with that. And the old issue management process with some updates to make it current for today's world might be something that we as professionals could advance, and it might end up being helpful for all of us. I don't know, but it's worth.
Very good. All right, thank you. Great. And so I want to pivot here a little bit and put this under the lens of maybe PRSA a little bit and talk about the PRSA Code of Conduct, which in this conversation I think is pretty pertinent. So the PRSA Code of Conduct clearly spells out our obligations around the free flow of information and states the core principle protecting and advancing the free flow of accurate and truthful information is essential to serving the public interest and contributing to informed decision-making in a democratic society. So panel, what is our duty as PR professionals bound by this code to support the integrity of our institutions and our relationships and to really aid in that informed decision-making referred to in the code? And I'll just throw that out to the panel.
I'd be happy to address that. I've had a lot of conversations with PRSA about this polarization and misinformation. And I think it's fair to view this as a communications problem. It's driven by media mainly, and it's taken advantage of by political communicators who have an interest in maintaining this conflict and are spreading information that benefits their own power and their profits. So I think that as communicators, we're the ones that are best equipped to help solve this. And I think that we're seeing business weigh in more and more often on these issues. In Texas, we saw 50, 60 companies come out about the new abortion laws, which was unprecedented. So I think that the time is right for business and for the people that communicate in business to play a more proactive role in finding solutions for all this. I think people would welcome more rational voices in the conversation. As far as I can tell, they're a little tired of the extremes on both ends dominating the conversation everywhere.
Other panelists.
I look like I'm not muted. I think it starts with each of us and reading the code of ethics, making sure we understand it and bring it to our own organizations, because that's the best start. We're the trusted advisors and the guardians of reputation. So I think that's the first part. And then once we are sure of our facts and our footing, then as Patrick said, we can be the advocates and we can go out and make a difference with other institutions and try to protect the larger society.
That's good, Sam. Patrick.
Yeah, I think it goes back, you have to look at our values, not only the advocacy, but honesty and fairness. And those are two things that are lacking in the conversation right now, is honesty and fairness, as Fred pointed out. I think also you go back to the provisions in the code, and as communicators, we're all about enhancing the profession as well. We need to raise the level and lower the temperature in the conversation and get it back where it needs to be. And as Fred pointed out, we are perfectly suited to play that role and advise our clients or our bosses.
No, I think that's spot on. John, anything to add there? Okay. All right. So on that note, the PRSA Code of Conduct also calls on us to act promptly to correct erroneous communications for which the practitioner is responsible. Kind of what Patrick was getting at there. So panelists, what are some examples of how this has been done or can be done effectively? And what should we do when we see misinformation being spread by other organizations, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally? So throw that out to the panel. Don't all speak at once.
I think I think that's really a dual-edged sword, Greg, because yes, we have an obligation to try to help correct misinformation and help point out where misinformation is being spread, but things have become so polarized, as Fred pointed out, that sometimes just doing that can have a spin-off effect that you weren't planning on. So I think that the key lies in, as Patrick said, lowering the temperature, finding a way to depolarize some of these issues. And probably the best way we can do that is not try to be argumentative or debate the issue, but simply to present factual information about what's happening and how it affects our organizations, our companies. And basically, one of the things that's bothered me throughout this whole period of time is that we don't even have a definition of facts anymore. We have facts and we have alternative facts and we have all sorts of permutations of facts. And I think as PR professionals, we need to help steer the boat back towards facts are facts. And this is real information. This other information is based on more on opinion and conjecture than it's based on science or based on good solid information. So I'm not sure exactly how we do that, but I think it's.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Fred.
I was just going to say, I have a podcast at USC called PR Future, and we had an author named Amanda Ripley on, who wrote a book about high conflict, and she was a Time reporter for a dozen years and still is a journalist, but she wrote about this intense conflict that we have. And she said she had spent her whole life in journalism thinking that facts were the most important thing. And she has realized through this study that, as John was saying, they don't matter as much anymore. And I think trying to fact check everything that's out there is an endless task. And I think we have to start telling stories a little differently and using a little more nuance and not just relying on the facts, because people all have their own facts. And I think that's the media is guilty of making everything black and white. And there's a lot of space in between that nobody explores, that I think as communicators, we can delve into the nuance of these stories, as opposed to just everything as one way or the other, because that's just polarizing in and of itself. But it's a complicated process, and it takes more time to do than to do the simplistic sort of storytelling.
Yeah, agree. Kathy, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the things is to catch the disinformation at its source. So how do you know that it's going on? So monitoring both with the services and technology, but also with your human ability to do that. And then once you see a story, where is it coming from? We had a client who had a healthcare problem, and it was coming from PTAs, mothers spreading the story one-to-one. So where we had to go to combat that disinformation was to the PTAs, and that was a hard place to go, but at least we knew that's where it was, and we're able to combat that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, one of our attendees made a comment here in the chat, pointing out misinformation is a full-time job today, and I think that's probably pretty accurate. So Fred, I want to pull a thread from something you said about reporting and kind of nuance. So like many of us who've been in the industry for a while, you know, the lines between factual reporting and opinion reporting have completely blurred. So we no longer, like, you know, when you turn on one of the cable channels, it's no longer clear anymore if someone is on an anchor reporting the facts or someone interpreting the facts and giving their opinion. So what change has that had kind of on how Americans maybe view the news and think about it? And has that, which I think I know the answer, but has that contributed to this polarization? And Fred, I'd love you to comment on that first.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, and I think it definitely has. And what we saw when we did a study at the beginning of last year, when Biden was elected, we said, what is changes that can have? And we asked 600 media, and they all said that there'd be less politics on the air and that viewership would go down. And viewership has gone down for all the cable channels because there's less political news. But the fact is that they're still editorializing as much as ever before. They're still as polarizing as they were.
Right.
And the interesting thing is, I don't even know how many of you are aware of it, but WGN launched a competing cable station called News Nation out of Chicago. It's a national competitor to CNN and MSNBC. And they don't do editorial. They only do straight news. And the idea was to have something that was down the center, unbiased, alternative to these other channels. And it's ranked one step below the Cowboy Channel in its ratings. And so the reality is people are trying to provide unbiased news, but nobody is listening to it. They're so used to listening to news that reinforces what they already think that they like that. That gets them excited, it gets them interested. And I'm afraid that that's not going to go away. I don't know what is going to compel these stations to switch to a more unbiased approach when that's what's getting the ratings.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that concept of selective attention, selective exposure. We just continually want to validate our own thoughts. Any panelists, other panelists' thoughts on that? Patrick, you were going to add?
Yeah, to what Fred was saying. News Nation is actually a good product. You know, they've got some solid journalism going on. Unfortunately, very few people are watching it, but it's still new. Al Jazeera was the same way when they were broadcasting here in the States. And they had hired away a lot of good, high quality network people. But, you know, because of their ties in the Middle East, it was not accepted in this country. You know, one of the things people will say, I just want the straight news, and we shouldn't, be looking at, all this negativity, that sort of thing. But we all slow down to take a look at an accident. We're all going to be enthralled with a flaming dumpster fire. And that's where we are today. How do we change those, how we're wired? And humans self-select. So unfortunately, over the past, really, it's been 40 years, the temperature has gone up, and more shrill, to the point now where we, have politicians, having their staff, putting out memes and idiotic videos. And what does that do to the conversation? It just dumbs it down even more. And
Society of Professional Journalists and have discussions about what the journalistic PR relationship is in today's world of disinformation. Because as we all know, editorial cutbacks have been rampant across the country. Newspapers are operating with far fewer reporters and editors and copy editors. Network TV has even made cutbacks. Local TV news seems to be holding fairly strong. But it might be that some high level discussion at that official.
Interesting comment. Yeah, I think that's accurate. So to add to this conversation, so we have Lynn's asking a question in chat. So how does critical thinking on the part of viewers and listeners fit into this conversation? I think we know the answer, but panelists, go ahead. Any thoughts on that?
I think I'm going to be the voice for personal responsibility on this panel, that it starts with each one of us and evaluate the source, evaluate the message, and really think what is coming out here and is it what I want to do it. And then if we think collectively as a group of professionals, we do have a voice that can help this conversation of how journalists and public relations people communicate and how information is disseminated.
Yeah. Fred, go ahead.
Well, there's a lot of issues there. I think that the recognizing misinformation is certainly part of it, and not disseminating it ourselves, but trying to create an atmosphere where this is not happening is the biggest challenge. And that's where I think that it's a challenge, because people have realized that they benefit from this, and as long as they're benefiting from it, they're going to keep doing it. And I think that that's the challenge for us, is how do we create a different structure so that that people they're being penalized for misinformation as opposed to benefiting from it. And I'm not sure that as long as we're watching the same programs that reinforce our opinions and voting for the same people and tweeting the same things that reinforce our opinions, that we're going to get anywhere. But it's very hard to change someone else's opinion on the other side. I think that's if we're focused on how bad the other person is, it's not going to probably have any positive impact. But we can maybe change the way that we look at things and the way we talk about things in these conversations a little bit more, and be more understanding and empathetic towards the other side, and not just think that because somebody has a different opinion than us that they're a complete idiot. And I think that's where we are right now. These two opposing poles start to look like each other, and they're saying the same things about each other, and it becomes a circle, a vicious circle that never ends.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if we could get back to the point where we could actually have actual conversations and talk about things and understand each other's views on different issues? But that'll never happen. It's a pipe dream. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I think that's spot on, Fred. I think that is absolutely spot on. All right, so on that topic, I want to pivot a little bit here to the concept of values-based communication. It's been brought up, especially in this context of misinformation. And Cathy, I know in particular, you've done some additional work in this space. So how should communicators consider a values-based approach to inform their work? And I'd ask Cathy to start, and then others obviously chime in as well here.
Well, I'll just offer a couple of thoughts. Many years ago, I read an article by Patrick Lencioni in the Harvard Business Review. I don't know if people have seen it, but it was challenging organizations to not only work on core values and have 5 of them and say what they were, but to actually believe in them and communicate them and live them. And I think that's true, because I know in our organization, at least, when we were talking about different communication, we were having client issues, and we ended up resigning our largest client. So if you don't resign the largest client and you're having an issue with those client and communication, what do you do? So that's the first part. And the second example I would share is in a strategic and crisis class that we do at Washington University. We teach about the first day is figure out who your company is, figure out what your values are, because on the second day, we have a crisis simulation for the whole day. And how do you know how to create messages if you don't know who you are and what you believe in? So I think the importance is knowing who you are, what you believe in, making sure everybody understands that, and they do appreciate that you live it. So again, I'm coming back to starting with that personal individual responsibility. And if we all take that and then we communicate together, we can expand and we can all figure out what we value in good common ground and actually communication.
Yeah.
And I think you can carry that to an organizational structure. The conversation I'm hearing all the time between corporate communicators is about whether or not they should weigh in on issues, these societal issues that are so controversial. Which one should a company pick? What should they say? Everybody's struggling with that. And I think that their own values are the number one determining factor of what they should say and when they should say it about what. And if something's happening in America that is contrary to the values of a company, I think it is in their best interest to speak out about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Patrick.
I'm working on a project right now. One of my clients is a very small nonprofit that helps women who have either come out of the justice system or they have gotten out of the life of being human trafficked, and they're human trafficking victims. They have a campaign that starts Monday asking men to just take a public stand and take a pledge to stand against human trafficking. You know, we invited the head of the Chamber of Commerce to come and talk about this because it's an issue in the community, in the state. And by the way, human trafficking is a crime. You know, we got a polite decline from the Chamber of Commerce because they said, oh, we couldn't address that. You know, it's like saying, come out against cancer, you know, come out against a crime and a crime against humanity. You know, what are your values? And Cathy, you're right. If a company doesn't know their values,
Right.
how can they speak on anything?
Yeah.
I think that's right. John, anything to add to that? Okay. All right. Shifting gears a bit to our favorite topic, social media, which obviously plays a really significant role in this discussion. So algorithms, blue check marks, offshore content farms, foreign interference, fact checkers. How social media played a role in the spread of disinformation and misinformation, and what can we as communicators do about it, including potentially government intervention and regulation. So I will throw that out to everyone on the panel. Social media, the topic of social media, how has it helped the spread of misinformation and disinformation? And I think we've already picked up on a couple of things already.
It's industrialized it.
Yeah.
It's an industry.
Yeah.
And ultimately, what you've got to do is follow the money. I think Fred alluded to this earlier. Who benefits from it? Follow the money. You know, Alex Jones lost a defamation suit to the parents of the children killed in Sandy Hook. You know, 10 people were killed in 2012. It's 2021. It took 9 years before that guy was held accountable. And still, now it has to go to a jury. Now there are more steps. We've got to find a way to hold people accountable a lot sooner. And man, you know, social media isn't helping, but maybe we can flip the page on that and use social media to hold people accountable.
And our study is based on social media. We looked at how stories are shared, media stories are shared on social from the left and the right. And it's interesting because the unreliable media, the ones that are using misinformation, are much smaller than the New York Times or the Washington Post, but they are shared very frequently. So the way that they are getting their information out isn't through their normal channels. It's because people who want to believe in this information, want to share it in their echo chamber, are using Twitter and other social media to share misinformation that's coming from the media. So it's given these small, extreme, unreliable media a voice that they never would have had before. And that's what I think is making it more dangerous than ever before. And I think that everyone's figured this out, and they're using this as a tool now, just as PR people use social media as a tool to build their brands. They're doing the same thing, but they're using it to spread unreliable information instead of factual information.
Yeah, in a way, it's democratized misinformation, right? Everybody can do it. Anybody
Yeah.
can do it. We all have access to it, right?
And Bob Schrum works at USC, and he was on a webcast with us about polarization, and he said that back in the day, if somebody would have come to Walter Cronkite and said, we want to do a story about people, burning torches in somewhere, he would have just fired them, But now anybody can do a story about anything, and other people can amplify that story with social media. So there's no editorial direction. There's no editorial control over the information that's out there. And people are spreading anything that they want just without any restrictions on it at all.
Mhm. Right.
I think
Cathy,
it
you
would
were
be a
gonna-
mistake not to engage. I think the key thing is to pay attention and be good at knowing what's going on and engage in the conversation. But that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort.
And it takes a lot of courage. A lot of companies don't want to alienate their employees or alienate their shareholders or their customers, and they're afraid to say anything. Before this broadcast started today, we were talking about State Farm, and State Farm just dealt with the issue that they didn't, obviously they didn't want to offend anybody, so they took this middle course. But I don't know that's going to work for everybody.
Mhm. So,
I think,
go ahead, John.
I think there's a two-prong approach here, Greg. One, which is we can have some direct control over within our companies and organizations. The other is that I think there have been some very positive developments recently about efforts to hold the big social media companies responsible for what's happening with information. They have taken some steps to try to address it, but I think most of us would agree there's still a lot more work that can be done. So I think for us to, as a profession and as individuals, to support government scrutiny of the big social media companies, while still keeping in mind the interests of free speech and the things that are near and dear to us as Americans, is a worthwhile thing for us to do. But at a more personal level or at a more individual level, I think it's time for us all to take a fresh look at our own social media policies within our companies and organizations. And many of those policies were developed a number of years ago when social media was more in its infancy and was not the same factor that it is today in terms of shaping and influencing opinion and behaviors. So I think that it would be good for us to take a fresh look at our own policies, make sure that we're holding our own business units accountable for the same policies that we've developed at the corporate level, to make sure that we are engaging, Cathy, but engaging appropriately, not being argumentative, not fueling the fire, basically, in terms of our engagement. And again, some of that can be controlled through policy, some of it can't. But I think it'd be a good place to start is to take a look at that and say, are those policies that may be now 8-10 years old still up to snuff in terms of the environment we're living in today?
Yeah, because the one constant with social media has been change, right? It's continually evolving and emerging platforms. And it's a great point. And one of our attendees even brings that up about, kind of reconsidering some of those social media policies that probably haven't been dusted off for a while, as you say, John, maybe for 8-10 years or even more. I think that's a really important point to bring up, and maybe it's something that we can all kind of commit to.
I think also you've got to have someone in a more senior role checking off on the social media posts. How many times have we seen where a 22, 23, 24-year-old employee is out on Twitter or some other platform and is being real quick and flip, and it just ends up hurting the organization. And of course, that person learns a very valuable but painful lesson by losing their job.
Yeah.
But it used to be that what you did on your own time was your personal life, and it didn't impact your business. But I don't think that division exists anymore. If people are working for a company and they're doing something on their own time on social media, that in fact comes back almost immediately to that company. So it is true, John, that these policies need to be updated because most of them, we did a survey and most companies don't have any policies related to employee activism. whether their employees are out there protesting for a cause or talking about something on social media. There are no rules and regulations for that. And I think that that's where these young people get in trouble. They don't realize that everything they do reflects upon the company they work for right now.
Well, and then there are obviously HR and legal implications for that. I've always just been fascinated by the idea that there's an inverse relationship in many organizations between when you think about the people who are actually responsible for the execution of social media, their standing or their status or their level in an organization. And there's an inverse relationship between that and how publicly visible what they're doing is, right? Think about that for a minute. You have interns posting something on behalf of a multi-billion-dollar organization, and it just defies logic in many cases, right? Cathy, you were going to chime in.
No, I disagree with what you just said. I think the senior leadership, it's important to actually not just send out emails about it or things, have meetings with the teams and actually talk with everybody and go through talking points and spread that out. I have a client who has a new strategic plan. The first step is going to be rolling it out to all the internal people to make sure they're trained as ambassadors. Then it will be going to the boards and the executive committees and everyone else, and then monitor that over the first year to make sure people understand the messages. What are we trying to say? What is our brand?
Yeah. Well, and I think as a follow-on to that, I think reviewing social media policies, having a better understanding top to bottom of how that's going to work operationally in different organizations. But in addition to that, Cathy, to your point, what else, there's obviously some inherent danger in stepping out, and most organizations are active at some level in social media, but what other things for our organizations, for our clients, should we be recommending in terms of, kind of proactively addressing these things and protecting your organization, taking steps to really make sure that we're managing the risk for our clients and organizations? What other advice might we give to the attendees here?
There's a lot of information out there.
Greg, one of the first things I do.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Thanks.
You go ahead, John.
I was just saying, one of the first things I would do if I was working in a big company or a big organization right now is sit down with the CEO and make sure they understand what's happening with social media and the impact that it's having, and that it's incumbent upon the organization to provide some resources to the PR function or whatever function they consider appropriate, but hopefully PR, to monitor that information appropriately, because there's a cost to that, either in terms of human capital or in terms of outside services that can help you automate that process. But if management doesn't understand what's happening and what's happening with social media, they're not going to put the dollars behind it to help you be able to manage it. So I think to have a frank conversation with the CEO, particularly in an organization that isn't particularly savvy with regard to social media, might be.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Fred.
I would just combine that with the PR people today have to understand all these controversial issues. Every company is faced with them, and whether they decide to speak out and address them or not, we have to be able to advise them on what the risk and rewards of that process are. And that's why a tool like the polarization index is helpful. There are other things out there that we have access to that can help us be better informed about all the things that are taking place in our society, so that we can counsel our companies on what's the best route to take when we're faced with these sort of issues. And it makes our job more interesting, but it makes it much more complex than it ever has been before.
Yeah, totally agree. Cathy, anything more to add?
I think they've kind of covered it.
All right, so this is where I give the attendees a warning that we're going to be looking for your submitted questions for about the last 15 or 20 minutes of today's session. So if you have thoughts, I know there's a couple that have come in, but if you have additional questions you'd like the panel to consider, please, you can go ahead and start submitting those now. So society, it's been said, has made it much more difficult for journalists to do their jobs with all the pressures and the different things that we just talked about, right? So given that, what role should business play? And Fred, this is something that you said a little bit earlier. I want to pick up on that. What role should business play in helping overcome misinformation? And in what ways can businesses advocate for the kind of journalism that conveys credible, truthful, factual information that really will get back to that value around helping benefit to the benefit of our citizens and helping make better informed decisions? So what role should business play in this conversation? Panelists.
I've already answered I think there's a big role for business to play across the board on all of this. It's just, and it's going to happen. We're seeing it happen now. More and more businesses are getting involved in things that they never would have thought of before. So I think it's just a matter of time until their voice is being heard very loudly in a lot of these conversations. But it has to be done with a certain amount of caution.
Well, and I think Fred's example of the collaboration between academia and business to produce this kind of a report is helpful to get the information out. And sometimes maybe CEOs need to be part of a corporate group or an industry association or something that helps them go out and start being vocal. They can't start out and say, I'm just going to go out with my own company. Maybe they need to collaborate with academia or businesses or firms. So Fred's leading the way with that kind of a survey.
And we're talking to a group called the CECP, which is CEOs for Corporate Purpose, based in Chicago. And they have a big membership of CEOs who are interested in using their businesses as platforms for bettering society. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a lot of groups that are headed in this direction.
It's easier to start as part of a group than it is to jump out there by yourself.
Definitely.
Yeah. John, Patrick, anything to add to that conversation?
I would just add, Greg, that I think there's some things that we as practitioners can be more proactive in doing. Sometimes we get caught up in what are we communicating now, or what's the message now, and that's important, obviously. But I would like to see us do more conducting briefings for media journalists before an issue hits the fan, and to meet with influentials in our communities. VIPs and people who influence other people's opinion, and to make sure that they have factual information about what in a school district or a company or an organization is doing. And it gives them some grounding, basically, when the what does hit the fan. It gives them a basis. They've already got some information, and they may be able to help us as allies in terms of going forward. So I think we could be more proactive about that. I think we tend to default to social media posts, news releases, media advisories, and less. I think we could benefit from using our communication skills to communicate with journalists and to communicate with VIPs and do that very proactively. And I think it might help us take some of the edge off of this.
John, you sound like you're talking about establishing and enhancing relationships with people.
I know it's a radical radical concept.
Love it. Okay, anything to add, Patrick? Anything to add?
I think they're spot on. I think John is right. And I think, as we're hopefully coming out of this pandemic, and there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel, maybe we can do a reset, and organizations can be more proactive and really start talking with, rather than just shooting out statements and social media posts, actually having real conversations with employees, with suppliers and vendors and other constituencies, so that, you can build up a little bit of goodwill in the community, because it's not a question of when it hits the fan, if it's going to hit the fan, it's going to be when. Yeah. And, that's just good business. Right. So we kind of need to kind of do a reset, and this is a real opportunity for us.
Yeah, and I think part of that conversation too is just being mindful that, as John said, I think the tendency is often to devolve to the tactical immediately and think about how we're gonna react to something, versus having a strategic mindset, as Patrick says, around like, hey, take a step back. Let's think about what we're really doing here and how we want to affect change for our organization. So I think that's a really great point. Thank you for that.
I think the Minnesota chapter really helped lead the way last year with regard to racial issues. And, hats off to Minnesota for that. We need to do more of that.
Now, if our football team could just beat the Packers on Sunday, we'd be happy. Having been past president of the chapter, I know there was a great deal of effort put into that and some very thoughtful, not just words, but actions put behind it. So I know the chapter appreciates that comment. All right, last warning to our attendees if you have questions. So final question before we turn it over to our attendee. So
Sorry about that.
final question. So clickbait, manufactured outrage, cancel culture, cable news, wokeness, censorship, virtue signaling. I would put those all under the heading of follow the money, which has been brought up a couple of times here already. So it's certainly reasonable to think or expect that someone always stands to profit from these ongoing efforts to quote unquote divide our country, right? And so as communicators, as professional communicators bound by a code of ethics, how do we identify and overcome that? Or more to the point, how do we as communicators make an effort to help lower the temperature? And I would love everybody on the panel to react to that one.
Well, I'll be happy to start with a little anecdote on this polarization study that we did. We have in the report, we identify which stories are driving polarization on a topic in a certain quarter. We also have the information about which individuals are driving that conversation by their retweets. And we had all of that in the report, and our attorney said, if you put that in the report, you're perfectly legal to do it because they're public figures, but their supporters are going to attack you. So we didn't put it in. And so I think that it's a conundrum, Greg, because you want to call out the people that are creating the problem, but when you do that, you put yourself in the firing line at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's a tough situation. So even studying polarization, we were afraid to call out the people that are creating it for fear we would be the victims of that. It's kind of ironic.
Right.
To put a word in for education, one of the reasons I went from being a PR professional in an agency and corporations was I wondered if could, by reaching MBA students, catch people earlier and educate them how to look at things and be an educated consumer and think about good journalism and facts and truth and all that sort of thing. So if we can educate the people we have outreach to, could we change the way that people look at it? And maybe it's a little bit at a time. And I'm a big believer in you change the world one person at a time, but maybe we could make a difference that way.
Yeah, you've got to find some common ground. When I worked for a government agency in Florida, it was an environmental agency, and we were trying to build support for $150 million restoration of a river. And you had all of these different state representatives, senators, county commissioners, and the idea was floated, well, we could do a big briefing and it's down at City Hall overlooking the river, it'll be great. And, as the PR guy, I said, why don't we put them all on the river? And they said, well, that'll be difficult. And it was. I ended up having to organize a flotilla because 75 people were involved, from the mayor and the state representatives and, of course, media. But we got them on the water and spent 3 hours explaining the water chemistry and everything else that was going on and all of these different interactions. But the way I sold it to the state agency where I was employed was, I just said, listen, all of these politicians, they think they know it all, and a lot of them think they can walk on water. I happen to know they can't. And once we push off from the dock, they are our prisoners. They have to listen. There's no escape. So we engaged them for 3 hours. And when we got back to the dock, everyone was like, yeah, this is something we have to do. And that package came together very, very quickly. But you start out one-on-one, but then if you can get everybody in the room together and talking, you can build some, coalesce a coalition there and actually come to a solution.
I think that's a great metaphor, both in reality and metaphorically there. Yeah. John.
I think one of the best ways to lower the temperature, Greg, is to not be raising the temperature. And I think as professional communicators, we face a lot of pressure from our CEOs, from our superintendents, from our board presidents and board directors. All of them want action now. And sometimes we have to counsel them and help them understand that maybe that by staying calm, by staying as factual as possible and not arguing or debating the issue, but simply getting the viewpoint of the organization or the company out there in an appropriate way is a way to engage without creating additional polarization. Because I think Fred's spot on when he says that sometimes if you put something out there, you're inviting a additional scrutiny and controversy that you might otherwise be able to avoid. So I think maybe it's as simple as it sounds. Sometimes lowering the temperature involves being sure we're not either consciously or inadvertently sticking a hot poker in the eye of the problem.
Yeah. Well, and I think it gets back to what Cathy was talking about with values-based, right? And I think that's got to be the lens by which or through which we look at these conversations. Anything additional to add on that last question? All right, we're going to pivot to what the last 19 minutes here. Questions or comments from the attendees. So there's a comment, but I think there's also a question in here around positive social media outreach by leaders and some examples here. But so examples where positive social media outreach by leaders has benefited an organization. So the challenge is how can organizations encourage activity that helps them while preventing harmful activity without making it feel transactional. So how do you strike that balance? I think specifically things that we can control, obviously, right, for our organizations. How do we strike the balance to the point that was brought up earlier? You have to have some guardrails and boundaries, right? But you can't prescribe what people are going to say or can say. So how do we work around that? How do we address both sides of that issue? Any thoughts?
Well, logically, you start with developing what your brand is, what your messages are. We talked about having meetings with people and doing training. And then if people do get way off the rails within the organization, I think conversations do need to happen, but that's pretty ABC approach.
Yeah. Okay.
Public Relations 101.
Right. So next question from the attendees from Allie, is there an additional risk to consider having a CEO or leadership team personally speak out on misinformation? Throw that out to the panel.
There can be a danger, but I think it can also be mitigated through working with the CEO to make sure that they understand the impact of what they're about to say, and basically letting them use you as their PR counsel to help them frame the message appropriately. But I think if it's done appropriately, I think having the leader of any organization speak is a helpful thing. It's just sometimes they speak without thinking about what they should be.
Yeah.
And I don't think, Greg, that that misinformation itself is a topic that CEOs are going to speak out in general. I think it has to be directed to a specific issue, misinformation about a vaccine or misinformation about immigration. And that's when it becomes a more powerful tool. I think even in the quiz that you did at the beginning, a lot of people don't realize the impact misinformation is having on them overall until you bring it down to the facts about a specific issue that is really impacting their business. So I think you have to make it seem real in order to make it valuable to people.
Inside the context, totally agree. Yeah.
Inside the values, as we were saying earlier, of that company, where does it really matter to a particular organization? And I think most companies have a place where that exists, but just the overall idea that all this information out there is somehow bad for them, I don't know if people get that yet.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. All right, Teresa says, as a government organization, we struggle with combating COVID misinformation. The inaccurate information on our social channels is overwhelming, and attempts to set the record straight and add more fuel to the fire. What strategies do you recommend to discourage negativity while relaying the facts? I think we've covered a little bit, but any more thoughts on that? So what strategies do we recommend for discouraging negativity while relaying the facts?
Well, I think on COVID in particular is an area where business has very much a right and a responsibility to weigh in. And in a business context, it's not so much, is the vaccine this, that, or the other? Is it safe? Should you be taken? If an airline says you have to take a vaccine to fly on our plane or to work at our airline, that becomes a more rational conversation. It's not a question of, is it right or wrong? It's just their policy. And I think that's why business can address these things without getting into all the moralistic aspect of it, because that's what they're saying that they want to do. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Fred, I think it comes down to a business talking in terms of personal responsibilities and what is best for the business and the organization, as opposed to arguing whether vaccines are good or bad. It becomes much more specific, and there's not the room for argument. Ultimately, you may have some employees and customers saying, well, I don't like that.
Yeah. And they can go somewhere else, right?
Pretty much.
To get a little tactical, we have medical school, and from the very beginning, we've had town halls, and they bring in these infectious disease doctors from medical school. We can ask any questions we want, and it allows the information to come out and just a very calm response, and that personal connection, and knowing that that's going to happen on a regular basis. By the time that our university was one of the first ones to require everybody to be vaccinated early in June or July, I don't think it was as contentious as it would have been had we not had all of this background over the year and a half prior to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. And Teresa clarifies that they're a government organization representing public health, not business. But I do think we took it within that context. Okay, it looks like we have cleared all of the questions from the attendees. So I'm going to throw it back to the panel one more time. Any parting wisdom, insights you'd like to share before we put a wrap on this? And I would ask you just to chime in with any thoughts that you might have that you'd like to share.
Jonathan Swift said it back in the early 1700s, but it's attributed to Mark Twain. A lie gets halfway around the world before the truth puts its boots on. It's never truer than now, especially with social media and a whole industry that is built on misinformation. So we just have to be on the top of our game every day as communicators.
Well, and if anybody wants to watch a really fascinating sports, you all were talking about football. Sports example that's unfolding right now is the lawsuit from St. Louis against the St. Louis Rams and the NFL. which is all about communication. And did the NFL and Stan Kroenke and the Rams mislead St. Louis as to whether we should invest in a new stadium? And so far, the St. Louis attorneys have done very well, and it goes to trial in January. And it will be very interesting to see what happens, and is business held accountable personally, and are there big numbers that happen in damages? But just the trial itself unfolding has been a very interesting story to watch.
Indeed.
I would just say that as a profession, that this is a real moment for us as communicators, and we should step up and take advantage of that and help lead this conversation, because I don't think anyone else is prepared to do that, and we should be able to, because I think, as I said in the beginning, a lot of this is a communication problem, and we're professional communicators, and I hope that as a group we will take on the challenge.
Agree. John, you were going to
I
say.
agree, Fred. Yeah, I agree with Fred completely on that. I think this is an opportunity, even though it may be a very tough opportunity. I think it's one where we can step to the table. I would just like to put in a plug for some of my former colleagues in school public relations across the country, Greg, because I think one of the things I want people to understand is the whole COVID-19 situation, and now complicated by the critical race theory discussions and the masking issue that is still very much alive in education, is beating school PR practitioners left and right. They feel like they're ping pong balls on a daily basis, because things are changing on a daily basis, and they have a lot of people telling them what they should do, and a lot of different viewpoints in terms of what should be done. So if you have a school district in your community, and as a PR professional can lend a hand to them, they might very much benefit from that. There are 16,000 school districts nationwide, and only about 1,000 of those have a PR professional, either part-time or full-time, helping them. So that leaves 15,000 school districts out there that are struggling with this all on their own. So help a school out if you can.
Great. Thank you, John. Okay, I think we've cleared the questions. We've had final comments. I think we're a few minutes early. So before we close it out, Drew, are there any final housekeeping details that we need to share with the attendees?
No real details. Eventually you'll get a survey for the conference. Please fill it out, and hope to see you at the remaining sessions that we have coming up today. And is today Thursday? Tomorrow. I don't even know what day of the week it is.
It is Thursday indeed.
That's
Well, great.
misinformation.
Thank you for that, Drew. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. I especially want to thank Fred, Cathy, Patrick, and John for serving as our excellent panelists. And in particular, Fred, for getting up extra early on the West Coast to join us, way too early probably. But with that, I think we stand adjourned, and I hope you enjoyed the panel. I know I did. I got a great deal of really meaningful information from it. So thank you all, much appreciated, and thank you to our panelists. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.